Next, we're going to use what we have already learned and combine some things to solve a new problem. So we already know how to use the zero product property to solve a quadratic, and we've recently learned how to factor trinomials. So we're going to put those together here. Now I've got trinomials equal to 0, and I want to solve them. So I've got x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. It's already in standard form. That step is done for me. The next step is to factor the left-hand side. Now, these questions are going to be starting to get mixed together, so think about the different ways that we know how to factor. We know how to take out a GCF, we know difference of squares, and we know grouping method for trinomials. This one here does not have a GCF between x squared, 4x, and 3. It's not a difference of squares, it's not something squared minus something squared, but it is a trinomial. So this is the one where I'm comparing it to ax squared plus bx plus c. I'm finding out what a times c is. And I'm finding two numbers that multiply to a times c, but add up to b. So in this case, I'm trying to think of two numbers that multiply to 3, but add up to 4. That would be 1 and 3. 1 times 3 is 3, and 1 plus 3 is 4. Now I replace the middle term with those two values. So I'm keeping the x squared the same, I'm keeping the plus 3 equals 0 the same, but I'm taking out the 4x and I'm replacing it with a 1x and a 3x. Next, I'm grouping the first two terms together and grouping the second two terms together and treating them as two separate GCF problems. X squared plus 1x has a GCF of x. After I factor out the x, I'm left with x plus 1 in the parentheses. Copy the plus sign. 3x plus 3 has a GCF of 3. After I divide out the 3, I'm left with an x plus 1. Copy the equals 0. If I've done this correctly, my binomials should be the same. I'm going to factor out that common binomial. When I factor out the common binomial of the first term, I'm left with an x. When I factor out the binomial of the second term, I'm left with a plus 3. Copy the equals 0. And here's where I'm now going to incorporate the zero product property. I have something times something equals 0. The only way that can happen is if one of those two things is 0. So either the x plus 1 is 0 or the x plus 3 is 0. And I'll solve both of those and I'll get two solutions. So x plus 1 is 0, I'll subtract 1 from both sides. X plus 3 equals 0, I'll subtract 3 from both sides. And my two solutions are that x could be -1 or x could be -3. Now you can check your answers here just like some of the equations that we solved earlier in the year. The way you would check one of these equations is you'd go back to the original problem and you'd plug in your two answers. So I'm going to go back to x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. First I'm going to plug in the -1 to check that answer. And I get 0 equals 0, so that works. And then I'll plug in the -3. And I get 0 equals 0, so they both work. I know my answer is correct.